So on now to our topic for today's discussion, which is the Latin influence on ancient and, by extension, medieval Greek. That is, the presence of Latin words in Greek, both spoken insofar as we can access it, but also documentary texts and possibly in literary texts. Now, why is this topic interesting? I'll mention a couple of reasons. First of all, Greek is, correctly, understood to be a language that has itself influenced many other languages in giving them words, but also concepts and, ways of thinking about things that perhaps might not have been possible. And, Greek speakers, understandably, hold this as a point of pride, that their language has, provided these fundamental templates for thinking about all kinds of things from politics and science to the arts and psychology and so forth. However, at various moments in its history, which is a long history, the Greek language has itself been subject to influences and borrowing words from other languages. Think of the ancient Near Eastern context, but in this case, we will be talking about the influence of Latin in the context of the Roman Empire. So this is a context where mostly Latin speakers are ruling over an empire that includes almost all Greek speakers in the world, and this inevitably is going to have an impact on the language that they use. Surprisingly, however, this has not been studied much, and it has not been studied much for a number of reasons. One of them is this idea that Greek is a source language rather than a receiving language when it comes to words and concepts and ideas and so forth. And also the idea that Greek speakers paid very little attention to Latin generally, in contrast to Latin-speaking Romans, who we know many of them who learned Greek and could speak Greek quite fluently. And yet we know that a number of Latin words sort of infiltrated and made their new home in the Greek language, ranging from terms of law, administration, and the military, to household goods, daily life, terms for measurement and economics, money, and so forth. These are not small areas of life. And actually, many of these terms survive in spoken modern Greek today, ranging from spiti for house to lukaniko for sausage, and many others. Now, a second reason why this phenomenon is so interesting is because during the medieval period, there were a number of different registers of the Greek language, roughly, forms of the Greek language. I'm just going to simplify them to two kind of ideal types, just for the sake of convenience here. There was spoken Greek, what people would speak in the street, at home, and so forth, which for almost all of the medieval period was a language very close to modern Greek, and after a certain point it essentially was modern Greek, linguistically speaking. But then there was also the language of literature, which could deviate significantly from the spoken language, and was in many cases more or less grammatically identical to ancient Greek, so classical Greek, Atticizing. There were a number of registers in between those two, but for the sake of this discussion, that should do. So the spoken language was the one where you would encounter many or most of these Latin loanwords. Also, they would appear in documentary texts relating to law, the court, administration, and so on. But in the higher registers of sort of classicizing Greek that many of our authors wrote in, they deliberately tried to avoid those terms as kind of neologisms, as terms that don't appear in the classical models of literature that they were following. And so if you're trying to reconstruct medieval Greek vocabulary or grammar, those texts that are written in the more formal register are going to kind of lead you astray. And you have to find workarounds to study the existence and history of the Latinate words in Greek during that period. You can work with papyri in the early period and inscriptions and things like that. Then there's a bit of a gap, and then we have more vernacular texts in the later period, and we have to find some way of crossing that bridge. We are now, thankfully, in a position to be able to bridge that gap far, far better than we ever were before, and this is due to a publication by my guest today. My guest is Eleanor Dickey, who's a professor of classics at the University of Reading, and she is one of the most extraordinary and rigorous philologists whose work I have ever studied. She has written anything from textbooks for Greek prose composition and Latin grammar to surveys of ancient and Byzantine commentaries on classical texts. And she has now delivered to us what is going to be one of the most interesting research tools to use moving forward, which is a book called Latin Loanwords in Ancient Greek, a Lexicon and Analysis. The core of this tome is a lexicon of Latin words that entered the Greek language. So most of the book is not something you exactly read, though I am precisely the person who read this book. But it also has some introductory and analytical sections about grammatical interfaces and the history of these borrowings, distribution patterns, and so forth. It is an incredibly rigorous and helpful book, and it sheds so much light on this very important, for me at least, area of the Greek language that is otherwise difficult to access because, as I said, many of the literary sources that we tend to use shy away from precisely this vocabulary, so it has to be found mostly elsewhere. Anyway, it was a great pleasure to read it and also to speak with Eleanor, who, as you can see from the precision with which she answers questions, is exactly the right kind of person to do this work and do it so well. So welcome back, everyone. I hope you enjoy this, and thanks again for medievalist.net for reposting these episodes. Here's my conversation with Eleanor. Eleanor, welcome to the podcast.
Hi.
I want to thank you for publishing this book, obviously for doing all of the long research that it must have required. This was a godsend for me and a tremendous benefit to the field. I've been waiting for something like this for decades. I didn't know that you or anyone was working on it. And I think it will open up so many fascinating new avenues of research and insight into the history of the Greek language. So let me just start off by saying thank you.
You're welcome.
So having said that, let's get a little bit of background on your research for this. So what got you interested in this area of research? And I ask this because the last scholarship that tried to tabulate some Latin words in ancient Greek is from a century ago. And I had looked at some of these publications that are in German and so on. So it didn't seem to be an area where there was much movement, which was kind of odd because classicists work on Greek and Latin, and you would think that they would have traced the influence of Latin on Greek, but it's possible that this kind of overwhelming sense that Greek is the dominant language in that relationship and gives more to Latin than the reverse. I don't know. So how do you read the state of the field in that regard, and how did you come to work on this project?
Well, I think you're absolutely right, of course, that people think a lot more about the influence of Greek on Latin than about the reverse. And that has to do with people being way more interested in the classical period than in the later periods. Because, of course, the influence of Latin on classical Greek is, shall we say, not really profound. There is a Latin word in Hesiod, by the way. It's an interpolation, but it's there. However, normally speaking, obviously there is no Latin influence on classical Greek. And if that's the Greek you're interested in, you're not going to be interested in Latin influence.
Right.
On the other hand, there is a lot of Greek influence on classical Latin. So if, kind of Virgil is what you're interested in, you're going to see it. I was actually working on other kinds of Latin influence on post-classical Greek, things like calques or syntactic influence. And those are very, very hard to pin down because you can see that something happens in Greek and you can see that something happens in Latin, but you can't really prove where it starts. Even if you can see it first in one language, it doesn't really prove it started there. And it doesn't prove, even if you could prove where it started, it still doesn't prove that there's a causal relationship. The both languages could be being influenced by something else. So still being convinced that there was a lot more Latin influence on Greek in the post-classical period than people thought, I abandoned that line of approach and thought, let me work on the words because words have etymologies and you know where they came from if you find them in both
Mhm.
languages. So I decided it would be easier. It wasn't really all that easy, but I decided it would be easier to do that.
Right. For someone like you or me, spotting a Latin word in a Greek text is fairly easy. I mean, like when we see it, we know this is okay, this isn't Greek. And then we run into all kinds of issues of interpretation that we'll come back to. But I wanted to ask a little bit about your working methods in all of this. Like, this is a fairly large lexicon, and even if you find many of the words are like not ancient or just kind of ghost borrowings or whatever, that they still require work. I mean, you must have been gathering this data for some time, or maybe not. So, how did you work through this?
Yeah, I mean, it took me more than a decade, to be honest. It was a really big project. So I started by identifying everything that other people had written on Latin loanwords in ancient Greek. And I put it all together. So I just combed all the modern literature, modern being a relative term, as you say, quite a lot of it is more than a century
Mm.
old, and made this giant list in alphabetical order of all the words that people talk about, whether or not I thought that they were really Latin loanwords. And then I went and I searched three big databases. So I searched the TLG, the Thesaurus Linguae Graecae database, which has a huge amount of Greek literature. It doesn't have everything. People often think it does have everything, and it does not have everything,
Right.
but it has an awful lot, ranging from sort of Homer up through the later Byzantine period. So I searched that not for the words, but for their Latin roots with various different spellings and kind of sifted through the results and found what I got. And then I searched the papyri.info database of documentary papyri the same way, searching for roots. And there, of course, I had to use every conceivable misspelling that you could
Yes.
possibly have. And
Right.
then I also searched the PHI inscriptions database.
Mhm.
And anytime I found something in any of those databases that I hadn't turned up in the others, I went back and searched the others. So I did a kind of huge amount of electronic searching, word by word or root by root in alphabetical order, and that took years. And then when I got to the end, I identified texts where I felt it probably needed a hand search as well. So that was things that were not in the Thesaurus Linguae Graecae at the time, such as Theophilus Antikythos's work, um, and also some things that were in the TLG, but or in the papyri.info database or in the inscriptions, but it was clear to me that they had a high density of Latin words, and I suspected that I would get something by a hand search. So then I went through and did hand searches of all of those texts. And then every time those hand searches turned up a word that I didn't already have, then I searched all the databases for that root. It was a kind of iterative process. And I don't think I got everything, and I wasn't really trying to get everything because there's a lot of words that only appear once,
Right.
and you're never going to get all of those. So I was just trying to get as much as I reasonably could.
Yeah. Wow. So I enjoy working with all of those databases that you mentioned. And sometimes during administrative meetings, I zone out and just go look for words in, in the papyri. And boy, do you find some really interesting things there.
Yeah.
But what you're describing is far that way too much of a good thing. I don't know. That's very methodical, and I don't know that I would do that. It's interesting that you mention Theophilus Antikythos because that isn't on the TLG, and yet it has a
It
number
is
of.
now.
Oh, it is.
They
Oh.
added it. I complained to them. I was a beta tester for the thesaurus's new version. And the new version has been around for so long now that like people have forgotten there is a new version. But there was a new version towards the which started went into beta testing right at the beginning of my data collection. And I was a beta tester for it. So my whole data collection was done on the basis of the current
Mm,
version,
okay.
which is jolly good. But also, um, they invited me to make suggestions. And so I suggested Theophilus. And no sooner had I searched the whole thing by hand than Theophilus emerged on the TLG. But never mind. It was very good that I did the hand search because there was a lot of stuff in there that I
Right.
wouldn't have got any other way.
Right. So, for the benefit of our audience, this is a Greek sort of version of the Institutes of
Yes.
Justinian. So, sixth century legal textbook. And it has a lot of very interesting things. Like, I could be wrong about which text this is, but it's from that area where Justinian cites Virgil as our poet. And the Greek version has something from Homer and calls it our poet.
I don't remember that, but it could easily be there. It won't have been what I was looking for, shall we
Yeah.
say.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
yeah, it's not, it says it's a paraphrase
Yeah.
of Justinian, and it's not simply a close translation, which is quite interesting because the rules were very strict that you were not allowed to produce a commentary. Um, it was the legal text had ballooned in size, and Justinian is trying
Mm,
to cut it down to something that students can reasonably learn in a reasonable amount of time.
yeah.
And so he makes it illegal to write commentaries on these texts. But Theophilus kind of gets around it by calling it a paraphrase and then sticking in um, various alterations and extra information.
Yeah.
Sometimes I
Well,
don't think he makes things any clearer, but it sure is interesting.
now faculty, what are you going to do? You can't actually get them to follow the rules. Okay. So let's turn to the substance of the work. So what kinds of words did Greek pick up from Latin? So tell us some of the major categories that you identified.
Right. So 16% of the words are military. So the Roman army is having a big impact. Now, everybody has always said the Roman army has a big impact. Actually, 16% is a lot less
Mm,
than most other studies have found, but it's still a big category. For example, the word for legion, legeon, the word for legionary, legionarios. These are words that the Greeks are borrowing very early on because the Roman army turns up, and although you don't have to speak Latin with the Roman army, they have Greek speaking people in the army as well. Um, they have these concepts like legion, which is not the same as any particular Greek unit. And they have all these words for their specifically Roman kinds of equipment, which the Greeks very quickly take over. And then another 16% are other government terminology. So government terminology excluding the legal terminology, which is only 7%, and excluding the terminology related to the emperor, which is 4%, and excluding the military. There's 16% left that's kind of
right.
other government. And that's interesting because some of that duplicates what you would have thought a Greek would have had more obviously. So like libellos, meaning petition. Well, they certainly had petitions before the Romans came along, but a libellos is kind of a Roman petition.
Mm,
Um, so there's these kind of government categories, and they amount to about half of the loan words if you put all the government categories together. And then there's a set of the other half of the loan words are things that don't have anything to do with the government. So 10% of them are clothing and textiles. And some of these are kind of typically Roman garments. Interestingly, not the toga. The word toga does sort of turn up, but it doesn't look like it was ever actually borrowed into Greek. Whenever they use the word toga, they explain what it is, which suggests that it's not a word that was borrowed. Um, but things like biros, the hooded cloak, um, that's that's a word that the Greeks get from the Romans. I'm not completely sure that they actually got the item from the Romans because I mean, hooded cloaks must have been around
Hmm.
longer than that. And and again, there is a sort of pattern with the clothing and textiles, which you can see in other cultures as well, that you do tend to get new items, obviously coming in cultural borrowings with their foreign words, but you also get foreign words being used to um, identify things that you have already. Because with clothing, it's cool to have a foreign name. And that's something that you see today as well. That
Hmm.
in if you do a sort of cross-cultural linguistic study, words for different kinds of clothes are more likely to be borrowed than words for many other things. And in the same category is words for food and drink. So 8% of the loan words are words for food and drink or associated eating implements. And again, that's just a category where having foreign words is cool. I mean, think about menu French today. It's just
Hmm. Yes.
it adds a sort of cachet.
Yes.
So you
Yes.
get things like perna, which means ham. That's a very early borrowing. And again, I wouldn't be surprised if the item in question was known before they decided to borrow that word. And then you get the kochliarion, the spoon. And there we know the item in question was not known. So the Greeks don't have spoons before they um, get them from the Romans. So there's kind of two different kinds of borrowings there. And then 7%, like I said, are legal terms. That's again, that's a lot less than people have traditionally thought. There's a huge surge of legal borrowings right at the end of antiquity, sort of in the sixth
Sure.
century. And the way I counted things was if you've got three good attestations by AD 600, or two good attestations plus Byzantine survival, it counts as having been borrowed before AD 600. And there are a lot of legal terms that don't quite make it, but they
Mhm.
are there in the Byzantine period.
Right.
Um, and that has to do with obviously Greek speakers being governed by Roman law. And
Yeah.
in the early centuries of the empire, a lot of that Roman law is being done in Latin, but then by the 6th century, it's being done in Greek. So you import into Greek the Roman legal terminology. And then 5% are measurements, things like million, the mile, or the names of the months. And that's quite a sort of semi-government terminology in the sense that, miles, why did Greek speakers measure things by miles? Well, because the Romans built roads and they put up milestones which said how many miles it was. And they weren't saying how many stadia it was. And therefore,
Right.
the
Yeah.
Greek speakers start using miles because there are all these Roman roads with milestones. And then all the other categories, I can go into them if you want, but all the other categories are less than 5% of the loanwords.
Okay. Now, these percentages, just to be clear, this is the percentage of that category of Latin loanword within the corpus of Latin loanwords.
Yeah, sorry.
Right.
Yes.
So it says nothing about frequency. In other words, there might be a large category, but it's used very rarely. And there might be a small category, like, I don't know, words about the emperor or something like that, that are used very, very commonly.
Yes,
But yeah,
that's right.
okay. So that's just a distribution of the different categories of those words, not their frequency of use or anything. Um, no, I take what you mean about words for clothing and food. In fact, there's a restaurant here in Chicago called Avec, which tells you all you need to know, I think.
Yeah.
Um, yes, so obviously these borrowings happened over a very long period of time, over 6 centuries, or more, actually, closer to
More.
7 or 8. And this encompassed many, many different encounters and historical situations. Are there some contexts that stand out to you for, like if I asked you to identify a couple of contexts in which this might have happened more densely, which ones would you point to?
I think my hunch is, I can't prove it, but my hunch is that Southern Italy in the Republican period was a real hotbed of Latin influence on Greek. Now, of course, we mostly don't have the Greek of Southern Italy from the
Right.
Republican period, which is why I can't prove it. But it just would make sense that the first Greek speakers who had intensive contact with the Romans would have been the first ones to come up with a lot of these terms. We don't see them mostly until later. Um, People have traditionally said that most Latin loanwords were borrowed in late antiquity, and
Hmm.
that's certainly not true. So if you if you look at all the Latin loanwords that there are and when each one was borrowed, you see that there are more Latin loanwords in late antiquity than earlier, because of course, once you borrow a word, it stays.
Right.
And so late antique texts are sometimes absolutely full of Latin loanwords, but most of those words were borrowed much earlier. However, if you graph when each loan word looks like it was borrowed, in other words, the first occurrence that I can find where it's being treated as a Greek word. I'm not counting as first occurrence times where a word is used, but it's explained or treated as a foreign word. So they say the Romans have this funny costume and they call it a such and such. And that's not a loan word, right? That's an explanation of a foreign word. So looking for the first time that it looks like it's being treated like a Greek word,
Right.
you can graph things and you get a borrowing peak in the second century AD. And at first I thought, okay, that's the answer, right? Their borrowing peak is the second century AD. And then I thought, now why would the borrowing peak be the second century AD? And so I thought about some other things you could graph, like the volume of surviving Greek literature. So
Right.
I tried graphing this volume of surviving Greek literature, and I discovered there's a big peak in the second century
Yes.
AD
Yes.
because we don't have that much, comparatively speaking, from the first century BC and the first century AD. And of course, those are periods when Romans are conquering Greek speakers at a great rate. So if you look at the context in which a lot of these words pop up for the first time in the second century AD, you often see them in the Atticus lexicographers. You're being told not to use them. And that means they're pretty well embedded at that point.
Right.
If the purists are saying, don't don't touch this word with a barge pole, or you might find them in a kind of linguistic work with the lexicographer saying, okay, this classical Attic word, it means this, and then using a Latin word
Right.
to explain it. Well, that tells you that the classical word is effectively dead in ordinary speech and the Latin word is taken over. It doesn't look to me like that's something that had only just happened last year when the lexicographers are saying it. So my hunch is, but like I said, I can't prove it, that you're probably getting a reasonably steady influx of Latin words into Greek over the whole period when the Greeks and the Romans are in contact.
Yeah. That is consistent with an observation that I can't get out of my head, which is the appearance of the word Christianos or Christian
Mm.
in first century AD Antioch, which is it's a very typical Latin way of forming the name of a group that follows someone. But this happened in Greek in Antioch, in a largely Greek-speaking city, in a Greek-speaking early Christian community. And to me, this is so striking. Like they must have already internalized sort of word formation in that context. And
Well,
Yeah.
There's two different ways to explain Christianos.
Okay.
Um, so the suffix is unquestionably Latin, as you said, that ianos
Yeah.
suffix. Um, so one can say the Greek speakers have already internalized that suffix, and they are making that word at that moment. But there's another possibility, which I think is more likely, which is it actually is a Latin word. So it was the
Yeah.
Roman
Roman
authorities.
governor. Yeah. Yeah.
Remember, the Romans are in charge at that
Yeah. Yeah.
point,
Yeah.
and they are responsible for dealing with problems. So, for example, we have two different ancient sources referring to a set of bandits called the Sicarii in first century Judea.
Yeah.
And that is clearly a Latin borrowing. There's no question about that one. It's the guys with the daggers, the Sicarii.
Yeah.
But we don't have that word in any Roman sources about this area. We only have it in the Greek sources because the people who are writing about problems that you had at that period are writing in Greek. But it's clear that the Roman authorities were the ones who kind of had to deal with these Sicarii. They're the ones who gave them the term, and then the Greek speakers are the ones who preserved it for us. So I think
Yeah.
what's actually happening with Christianos is that the Roman authorities perceive a new source of trouble, they make a term for it, and then it's the Greeks who preserve it for us.
Right. Which is itself, if that possibility is right, and it may very well be, another interesting insight in how Roman authority and power was actually naming things for people on the ground and
Mm.
with long-lasting consequences. Anyway, um, we can talk more about this, obviously, but I wanted to ask you to explain a kind of fundamental distinction that you use in the book between a borrowing, a loan word, and code switching, which you invoke in many places. Can you tell us what that distinction is? Give us some examples of those two kinds of words.
Yes, definitely. So a loan word is a word of foreign etymology, which has become part of another language. So in English, the word chair is a loan word. That comes from French, but we don't know and we don't care, right? I mean, we think of
Right,
chair as an English word.
right,
Slightly less integrated is quorum. So a lot of English speakers are aware that quorum comes from Latin. But the way we use it is not a Latin word anymore. It's an English word. In Latin, it means of which. It's got nothing to do with meetings or anything
right,
like that. And you certainly can't make it plural and say quora, let alone say that the meeting was quorate or in quorate. Those are purely English um, treatments of quorum. So
right,
quorum is definitely an English word, but people are kind of aware of it being a borrowing, as opposed to chair, which is an English word, but people are no longer even aware. So those are both loan words. A code switch is a foreign word which has not been assimilated into another language. So, um, for example, vache is the French for cow, and I have to tell you that because unless you happen to know French, you do not have that piece of information because the point is it's not an English word. But that doesn't mean that you can't ever use it in an English sentence. So I just did use it in an English sentence, for example.
hmm
Um, and you can do that, and the ancients very often do, where you label a word as belonging to another language. Bilingual speakers can also code switch in a different and maybe more interesting way, where they can use elements of two different languages. So if you have two speakers who both speak both English and French, they can just pull words from one language into speech that's basically in the other language. And that that is something that the ancients definitely do as well. We see Cicero doing it when he writes to Atticus. Cicero
mm
learned a lot of Greek and he was at school with Atticus, who also learned a lot of Greek. He knows that Atticus will know all of the Greek words he uses. and he is quite happy to use them. Same thing with good old Theophilus Antiquator. He will quite happily use Latin legal terminology in his textbook. He is writing for students who need to be able to cope with this terminology, and so he's going to use it. He's not going to try to translate it. It's easy to tell with Theophilus because he puts the Latin words in the Latin alphabet. And it's easy to tell with Cicero, he puts the Greek words in the Greek alphabet, but those are not what your normal Greek speaker did. So your normal writer of a Greek papyrus in the middle of the Roman period doesn't know the Latin alphabet and doesn't care. And so you have a problem identifying code switches. We know that the ancients did code switches, but we also know that they're not always going to mark them for us by saying, hey, it's a Latin word, or putting it in the Latin alphabet or anything like that. And so one of the problems that I had throughout the book was to identify which of the Latin words appearing in Greek really are Latin loanwords in Greek. That's to say, a monolingual Greek speaker at some place at some time might have known and used this word. And which of them are really code switches? That's to say, the only people who use those words are people who knew Latin.
Right. Okay. And so as you were speaking, first of all, it occurs to me that there's probably no more Latin-looking word than quorum, just, just on the face of it. It probably just embodies Latinness in so many ways. But as you were speaking, I was thinking that it's important to specify here that you really are taking a kind of linguistic etymological approach to the actual words that are being used. And not, for example, trying to track sort of other kinds of influences on Greek. Like, for example, the names of the days of the week, right? I think there are two modern languages, I think it's Portuguese and Greek, that preserve the Roman naming of the days of the week, which is not a very imaginative approach, calling them first, second, third, fourth, and so forth. Um, but this is what happens, at least after late antiquity. I don't know when this begins to appear, Deftera, Triti, Tetarti, Pempti, and so forth. But that's not a loan word, right? That's a different kind of linguistic influence.
That's right. That's a translation. And
Okay.
it is very much linguistic influence, but it's a different kind. So
Mm.
that's part of what I was working on before I started working on the loan words. So, for example, the Greek word parakalo, I think that's a translation
Right. Yeah.
of a Latin word for please. The classical Greeks don't have an obvious please word. I'm not saying they're rude. I don't think they are rude, but they don't say anything that we could call please when they make requests. They say things like dos moi,
Yeah.
give me, which translators have trouble with. People who translate classical Greek texts are constantly trying to insert something to soften
Yes.
these requests that look really rude to us. And it's clear in context that they are not rude to the ancient Greeks, but they must have been rude to other cultures. And when the Greeks are conquered by the Romans, they start needing to be polite in ways that Romans can understand. And so they start translating the Roman words for please, which are basically things that tend to mean I ask for, or I beg for, or I pray for. Um, and there's more than one of those, but one of them that
Mm.
sort of makes it in the long run is parakalo. And I'm absolutely convinced about this, and I find it really, really interesting tracing it. But not everybody believes me, which is exactly why I decided to move to working on words where the etymology is unarguable, because these translations, it can be so difficult to prove.
Right. So I was thinking also of the distribution of these words in the sort of corpora or the bodies of ancient literature and texts that survive. And there's some obvious categories where you would you probably ground to a halt because every few lines you would encounter a word like this. And the legal texts are obviously one category, but
Mhm.
there are also texts that were written right in the period when, by your conclusions, there should be lots of Latin words circulating in the culture, but where you probably found very, very, very little to none, which is not an accident. Can you talk a little bit about that kind of difference between these two bodies of text? What's going on that in one you just keep finding them and in others you find none?
Yeah. Well, obviously, like I said, classical Greek literature does not contain Latin words. And so when you get the Atticist movement, and around the second century AD, Greek speakers start thinking we should really write the way they did in classical Athens. Well, obviously, one of the first things they strip out is the Latin loanwords. And it's an interesting question to what extent the sort of colonization of Greek by Latin words may even have been part of the catalyst for Atticism. You just get so many foreign words at a certain point, the way the French start objecting to all the English words in French, the Greek speakers are clearly objecting to all the Latin words in Greek. And there's different kinds of reactions to that. So you get some Atticus texts which allude to these words and sort of play with them without actually using them as Greek words. And then you get other ones that just avoid them. They just, they really just do, right? Like it was the 5th century BC and don't use the Latin words. But they're making a huge effort to do that. That's not the way their
Hmm.
language normally works. And you can see how their language normally works if you look at the documentary papyri, because the documentary papyri contain lots and lots of Latin loanwords. Basically, by the 4th century AD, you have, in terms of frequency, um, more than one attestation of a Latin loanword for every fragment of documentary papyrus that you've got. And if you think about how small some of these fragments are,
Right.
that's a very high density. And
Yeah.
it's about 10 times the density that you get in imperial period Greek literature taken as a whole. And if you think about the imperial period Greek literature taken as a whole includes some texts that have a lot of loanwords. It also includes a lot of texts that have very few or no loanwords.
And this might partly explain why this work hasn't been done yet, because classicists or classical philologists are primarily drawn to those more high register Atticizing texts as literature, and those are the texts that are avoiding Latin loanwords systematically, and so their presence is kind of occluded. Their existence in the spoken language comes from corpora that most classical philologists don't often read, or at least interpret. It's not literature as such in many cases. So this might be why.
Mm.
Because I also work on, well, I work on both kinds of texts, but when I'm reading someone like Procopius, I'm usually aware or sometimes hyper aware that when he's using a particular expression, it's to avoid using the one that he uses off script, as it were. In particular, like the
Yeah.
term Romania, which is something I've been very interested in, that was clearly spoken on the streets in Constantinople and is the vernacular common term for the sort of state and society that they live in. And he never uses it because I think that's just a kind of neologism that
Mm.
proper writer wouldn't use. Um, anyway, yeah, these are you work through these problems. I mean, in the book and all the analysis that you do. So, I mean, this is these are very interesting problems in working through these texts, which I love to do, and so you've given us a great tool here. There are some categories of words that I wanted to ask you about, which you label in the lexicon as quote non-existent, which is a very interesting category by itself. So there's non-existent or quote foreign or not ancient. So what do these mean?
Right. Well, non-existent means that, as far as I can tell, there never was such a word. So remember, I'm dealing with a lot of scholarship, which in some cases is quite old. And
Mm.
so you get these people who kind of have found a word in a text and they've stuck it into a list, often without a reference to where they found it.
All right.
And then if you track it down, often what happens is, well, that text has been reread and it does not contain that word anymore. And there is no other text that contains that word. Or so very often it's a superseded reading. There are an awful lot of those. Um, but there's another possibility, which is that it is still the reading, but it's a supplement. The whole thing is in square brackets in someone's edition of the papyrus. Now, I'm not saying that all supplements are necessarily wrong, but if you supplement your text with a word that's not attested anywhere else, that does not make that word suddenly become a Greek word.
Mm.
So there's actually more than 200 words that people have previously claimed as Latin loanwords, where when I looked, they didn't have a single secure attestation, not one, um, which which is
Yeah.
pretty sobering, actually. That's
Yeah.
that's a lot of words. If you consider that I found about 820 loan words, 200 words being um, completely unattested is sobering in
Yeah.
terms of the impact that these non-existent words have had on people's understanding. So that's the first category. And then not ancient is related to that in the sense that um, that those words do exist, right? If it's I say not ancient, the implication is it does exist, just not in the ancient period. And so sometimes that's the same kind of situation as in the ancient attestations turn out either to have been reread or they're all in square brackets, that there are no secure attestations
Mm.
from the ancient world. Sometimes there never were because some of those early studies didn't didn't really um, pay close attention to the dating of texts. So Viscidi, for example, he looks at everything up to 1100, and he gets an awful lot of loan words by looking
Mm.
at everything up to 1100. But of course, what's going on is different at different times. Not all of those words are going to come from Latin because by the time you get to like the 10th century, you're getting words being borrowed from Romance languages. It's not really quite the same process anymore. Um, Another way that things become not ancient is that a text gets redated. So my cutoff point, you have to have one somewhere. So my
Sure.
cutoff point was AD 600. And quite a few papyri and inscriptions get redated on in various directions around there. So for me, there had to be an attestation that was really pretty clearly datable to before AD 600 for it to be ancient.
I see. Okay.
And
Now,
then,
yeah.
and then
But
foreign is the word does occur and it does occur before AD 600, but when it occurs before AD 600, it is always in some way treated as not being part of the Greek language. So, for example, if it is only in the Latin alphabet, or if people say it's a Latin word, or if people always explain what it means, then I'm figuring they're treating that as a foreign word.
okay. Yeah. Yeah, that makes the lexicon very sort of diverse in the type of categories that it includes. Since that's it's just a straight list of hundreds and hundreds of straightforward loan words, yeah, everyone using this has to be very careful about what kind of word they're dealing with there. So we talked earlier about one way in which Latin seems to have influenced Greek word formation in the case of Christianos or Christian. Can you give us another example of kind of Latin linguistic influence or grammatical influence on Greek?
Yes, there are quite a few suffixes. So ionos is one of them. Another one is arios, which becomes a suffix for professionals.
Hmm.
So that one, that's probably the first Latin suffix that enters Greek. And you can get it quite early because you get legio, the legion, and legionarios, the legionary soldier. And any Greek who has those two words, it's quite easy to work out that arios would mean it's a profession. And actually, in Latin, arios is a much broader suffix than just for professions. But for Greek speakers, for most of the Roman period, arios, when they add it to a Greek word, it means a profession. So you get a mekanarios is an engineer, um, because a mekane is a machine, and a smaragdarios is an emerald worker because a smaragdos is an emerald.
Yes.
Um, you also get aton, which is a suffix for beverages. And that one's really interesting. It stops being a suffix for beverages in the Byzantine period when they borrow atos, and then aton is just the neuter of atos. And it never is a suffix for beverages in Latin. Beverages are feminine in Latin, but there's this brief period when you get this really productive aton suffix in Greek. So iaton, a beverage with violets from Ion. Carofulaton, which is wine scented with cloves from carofulon. Um, Kudonaton, a drink made with quinces from kudonion. So you get a whole set of these terms. It's very clear with the medical writers that you can just add aton to absolutely anything, and you get a drink made with that. And I think that's quite cool because it's something that Latin didn't have, but that Greek still managed to get from Latin.
Yeah. Now you're speaking my language. There's so many of these words in sort of post-ancient Greek that I come across all the time.
Mm.
But you also reminded me of a experience I had in the Greek army. I'll be brief, but in the Greek army, a lot of commands and technical terms for what you're supposed to do are in classical Greek. Very few of the soldiers actually understand that they're being spoken to in ancient Greek. Sometimes they try to convert what they're hearing into modern Greek, but sometimes they think that they're being spoken to in English. And so, striking example, yes, 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 yes. And what's worse is they then proceeded to make up new words based on what they thought was an English command, what was in fact ancient Greek. So erpin, which is crawling on the ground, just kind of like under barbed wire and all of that, they thought that was an English ing ending, erping. And so they used it to create new words for everything you were asked to do something like pick up cigarette butts. Cigarette butts in modern Greek are ropa. So it was roping. Yes.
Wow.
Yes.
Wow.
The odd thing is that if you convert it back to ancient Greek phonetically, it does kind of work, but that's not what they thought they were doing.
Yeah.
Anyway, yeah, word formation. Um, if you let people use words, this this is the kind of thing they'll do. Anyway, all right. Actually, speaking of that, it because I'm not sure those terms that they were coining were more like names for activities that kind of fall between nouns and verbs. Now, Greek is sort of notorious for being able to absorb nouns way easier than verbs, right? But English is not quite so resistant to verbs. We can always say to Xerox, or whatever. Um, so did you find exceptions to this pattern? You found Latinate Greek verbs, right? Can you give us striking examples of that?
Yes, my favorite one is aditeuo, which is to take possession of an inheritance. And that comes from Latin ad eo, which means in classical Latin to go into. And obviously, the heir goes into the inheritance when he takes possession of it.
Right, right.
But very often, when the Greeks are borrowing verbs from Latin. They want to borrow it from what we would consider the fourth principal part. And now ad eo not being a transitive verb, you might think, well, how does it even have a fourth principal part? But it does. It's ad itum. So you take ad itum and then you take off the and you add eo, which is not the only verb formation suffix used on Latin words, but it's quite a common one. And then you get aditeo, which you can inflect in every way that a Greek verb
Yes.
inflects. So I've got things like aditeusantes,
Ah.
the participle of it.
Yes, yes.
Um, Aditeusa, the
Yes.
aorist with the augment. It's astonishing what they can do with that verb.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah, they like the legal people, they really like to take the fourth principal part. Some of the earlier borrowings work a bit differently. So um Bukinizdo probably comes from Bukino to play the
Trumpet.
Roman army
Yeah,
trumpet.
yeah,
And that's obviously a different formation process.
yeah. Yeah. These are the real gems. I don't know. Do you have colleagues who like send you like I found this really odd Latin
Yes,
form for yes, yes. Okay. I get the
yes,
same too.
yes, they do.
Just real, real gems. Anyway, so Eleanor, we're almost out of time. I was wondering if, as in conclusion, you could tell us two of your favorite Latin loan words in Greek and why you find them interesting.
So one of my favorite words is Romaios, the word for Roman. And that's because it starts out being a word for Roman and it ends up being a word for Greek. And that obviously has to do with the transfer of the center of Roman power from Rome to Constantinople, and then the complete concentration of Roman power in Constantinople. So the only Romans left were the ones who spoke Greek. And I just think it's really cool that we have an English word today, Romaic, which means
Mm.
modern Greek and comes from that word Romaios. And the my other favorite is abrebis, which means the official who deals with letters. Now, the the Romans had a title formation process where you put "a" together with the thing that the person's responsible for. So Secretus is your secretary, the guy who's responsible for your secrets. Ab actis is your kind of legal clerk, the guy who's responsible for the acta. Um, and these things are usually attested in both Latin and Greek. But a brevis, well, that's the guy who's responsible for your letters because it's a plus brevis. But brevis, it should be a brevibus if it were really taken from
Mhm.
Latin. The fact that it isn't, that it's not attested in Latin and in Greek it's a brevis, I think that tells us pretty clearly that this is a Latin title that was coined within Greek. Because just as nowadays we feel that certain terminology it really should be Latin, like if people discover a new plant or a new life form, they often think we need Latin terminology for this. And so they'll come to the classicists and get us to help them produce a word for it. And we might very well come up with something that's not quite right. Um, in the same way, in the later empire, certain kinds of government offices they needed a Latin title, even if there was not a Latin word that was relevant.
Mhm. This, these kinds of stories, and there are stories behind all of these words. That's the fascinating thing. It would be so interesting to write a kind of history of, I don't know, Greek or at least of this cultural interaction just through words. So just pick a number of words and try to burrow into the backstory of these words the way you were just doing to reconstruct the kind of settings in which these problems came up that were solved with that word. I think that would just be a very interesting kind of history, like a history of Greek and Roman interactions in antiquity through, I don't know, 50 words or something like that. It would flesh out so much that isn't told to us by historians and, the sources that we have. Yeah. Anyway,
You're
think
right.
about it.
That would be fun.
Yes, it would. Eleanor, thank you so much for coming onto the podcast, but especially also for producing this wonderful lexicon. I think people are going to be diving into it for, research and all kinds of interesting more studies in the years, decades to come. In fact, I think this is going to be with us for some time. So thank you.
Great. You're welcome.
Take care.